Okay, good morning. My name is Mark Imus. I'm Acting Director of Indigenous Relations with the Climate Action Secretariat with the province. Thanks for the opportunity to come and talk about climate action. Patrick invited me to just come talk about some of the climate action initiatives and policies at the provincial level and how we're engaging with Indigenous nations. So I thought I'd start with this image. This was developed as part of the Indigenous engagement we did back in 2021 when Clean BC Roadmap to 2030 was being developed. This is an image developed by Kristen Elko as a result of the sessions. Also, I wanted to thank the Endlakottan leadership and the Village of Lytton and Jackie. Thanks for all the leadership that's been part of the rebuilding of Lytton. So this is an image of an Endlakottan basket. I like to recognize the culture in places where I'm speaking, and this is an Endlakottan basket that's part of the culture that are done by Endlakottan women, and so if you look at the colors here, they use cherry bark and grasses for geometric designs, and it was part of the Salish trade network, and I just mention it really as part of the enduring culture of this region. So again, what I'm going to talk about is really a quick overview of the Clean BC Roadmap to 2030, an overview of the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. I'll talk a little bit about the disaster, climate risk, and resilience assessment that's being done, and that's being led by emergency management and climate readiness. And then I can take any questions at the end. So the Clean BC Roadmap to 2030, really, when Clean BC was first done, it envisioned a plan to implement all of the climate policies for British Columbia. The roadmap is that plan. Climate change is part of our daily lives now, and if there's been anything that has been positive about the disaster in Lytton is that the whole world is taking notice to these kinds of changes and the kind of devastation that it can lead to, and we've seen that with the fires and the floods. So again, the original Clean BC plan was launched back in 2018. It had over 40 initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote more clean energy, transportation, transition our industry and buildings to more efficient technologies. These initiatives were projected to achieve approximately 75% of our 2030 target of reducing emissions 40% below our 2007 levels. And then Clean BC committed to a plan to fully achieve that target, which was then articulated in the roadmap. So I'm going to just run through a number of the pathways that were identified in the roadmap. There's 8 key pathways to generate greenhouse gas emissions or areas that could generate climate solutions to reduce emissions or avoid them altogether. So these 8 areas are agriculture, aquaculture and fisheries, forest bioeconomy, transportation, buildings, negative emissions technologies, low carbon energy, communities, and so there's a bundle of things in there. I'm not going to go into all the details of this because that would be probably more like an hour and a half presentation. So I will try to keep it short. And then importantly, industry, including oil and gas. And there's more policy under development right now for the oil and gas sector, and Indigenous consultation that's just kicking off on that. So some of BC's marquee measures around climate action. It's a big plan, the roadmap. It's cross-government, it's multi-sector, and it's founded on implementing the policies and then continuous feedback. So we're constantly doing engagement to update policies and inform and adjust as needed based on what we're hearing and the response from all sectors of the economy. So these marquee measures were introduced in the roadmap. It follows the advice that we received from the Climate Solutions Council, which includes representatives from academia, business and industry, Indigenous peoples, local government, labor, youth, and environmental groups. And this input has been informed by the experience and the advice from that council. Patrick Michel is a member of the Climate Solutions Council. So it's really a result of lively and informed debate to find consensus perspective. So again, I won't read all of those. You can kind of see what the measures are on the screen there, but it's a lot of what I spoke to in terms of the pathways and trying to achieve those carbon emissions, greater efficiency, and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So I did mention the natural gas or the greenhouse gas emissions cap for natural gas utilities. And that has a variety of pathways, and as I said, there's more policy coming for the oil and gas sector. This graphic gives you a bit of an overview on the timelines for all of these different key measures and how they're funded through provincial government funding. So we're right here, budget 2023. And it's got a revised carbon pricing system. So there was consultation and engagement on that, and more to come to implement all these measures. I will provide a copy of the slide deck too, because I realize it's a bit washed out with the light in here, so folks can have a look at it later. This was also included, this same graphic was included in the Climate Change Accountability Report, which just came out at the end of this past fiscal year. And that's really how government reports and is accountable for achieving its targets or where there are shortfalls, explanation of why. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that accountability report. So in terms of near-term priorities, developing greenhouse gas reduction standards for natural gas utilities, amending the Zero Emission Vehicles Act to accelerate zero emission targets for new light-duty vehicles, developing medium and heavy-duty zero emission vehicle targets, and then developing the highest efficiency equipment standards for all new space and water heating equipment. And then expanding their low carbon fuel standard for aviation and marine fuels. So the regulations for that would be brought in with a new act in January of 2024. On the transportation front, also there's a Clean Transportation Action Plan, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So Indigenous engagement, so my role within the Climate Action Secretariat is really on the Indigenous relations. And we've held, there's been extensive engagement in the development of the roadmap, including ongoing sessions again, so we get ongoing feedback to ensure that Indigenous voices are part of BC's climate policies. So we held a series of sessions in the fall, both virtual and in person, and had over 90 nations, over 130 people attending, the combination of those, and that generated 60 recommendations back to government on a whole number of different topics under the Clean BC roadmap. Some of the key feedback from nations we had was reduction of materials going into landfills must be a core feature and part of the circular economy. So there's work underway to develop policy around encouraging the circular economy. And then the economic model must be fair and equitable for the distribution of goods and services, along with strengthening the economic security of Indigenous communities. Those are just a couple. Some of the highlights from this past year, 22-23. So development of the new Low Carbon Fuels Act that was passed in the spring of last year, and establishing the new local government climate action program. There was the oil and gas sector royalty review was completed. I mentioned the vehicle stuff already, so maybe I won't go over that. There were BC building code updates requiring 20% better energy efficiency for most buildings, and then new income tested rebates for Better Homes and Buildings program. So a carbon tax target of $50 a ton for CO2 emissions met in April 2022. Okay, I'm going to shift gears now just over to the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. So there was an initial climate risk assessment done in 2019 and work on developing the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. So hopefully folks are getting the message that we're aggressively pursuing emissions reductions, but we know the impacts of climate change are here already. And so the province, and along with partners, is also investing in adapting to those impacts. And so that's really what the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy is about. And it has 4 pathways, which you can see on this graphic here. Expanding climate and hydrometric monitoring, improving our drought and flood forecasting, climate risk assessment, which I'll talk about in a minute, education and capacity building. Under safe and healthy communities, so that was under the Foundations for Success, the local government climate action program, hazard mitigation funding, health system, climate resilience, and BC flood strategy. So some folks may have been involved. There was quite extensive engagement to develop the BC flood strategy, and then extending our floodplain mapping provincially. Under resilient species and ecosystems, there's a Healthy Watersheds Initiative, watershed security strategy, a coastal marine strategy that's under development, and a wild salmon strategy as well, which are being developed with Indigenous partners, a future ecosystems center, and then addressing regulatory barriers and enablers for nature-based solutions. So under climate-ready economy and infrastructure, adapting our highway and resource road infrastructure, having more low carbon resilient public infrastructure. So for public sector buildings, making sure that those are low carbon or net zero if possible. And then climate ready agriculture and tourism, and making those sectors more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So the overall vision was a climate resilient society prepared for and adapting to the impacts of climate change. During the engagement for the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy, we heard strongly that people were not just concerned about what we do on adaptation, but how we do it. So these 6 guiding principles address that feedback and guide our adaptation work across government and with our partners. including and working in partnership with Indigenous partners is central to the work that we do, and contribute to the necessary evolution for the relationship between government and Indigenous nations, communities and organizations. So we work with Indigenous advisory groups, partners and contractors to learn how we can do better and share our information on evolving practices with our colleagues and partners. Equity-informed approach is one of the things mentioned. So government requires analysis of equity considerations in our policies through approaches like gender-based analysis. So last year we worked with a team from Simon Fraser University and Shift Collaborative to release the report Climate Change, Intersectionality, and GBA Plus in British Columbia to inform our action and policy development for the strategy. Nature-based solutions I mentioned briefly before. That's how we can use nature-based solutions to both sequester carbon and reduce climate risks. So there's work underway to develop a new forest carbon offset protocol for offset projects. And utilizing nature-based solutions for those climate sinks, but also ensuring that we can achieve our goals to climate changing conditions using nature-based solutions wherever possible. Health and well-being, especially mental health, needs to be a bigger part of our work. This is a newer area, and so we're rapidly gaining awareness of how climate change affects mental health. We need to make sure that our greenhouse gas reduction actions function in a future with hotter climate. Adaptations need to be aligned with our emissions goals, and we need to think about them together. So buildings are a great example of that. So investing now is going to save us money and hardship down the road, and will allow us to derive competitive benefits as well from being proactive. This graphic just shows some of the climate projections and impacts. So even if global greenhouse gas emissions are met, the Earth's climate is changing and serious impacts are inevitable. BC's not prepared as demonstrated by the damage and loss, including loss of life that occurred in 2021. So in addition to meeting greenhouse gas emission targets, to contribute to the global effort to stop climate change, we also need to adapt to our changing climate, and that's playing out here in BC. So I'm glad to hear about some of the comments that were made about the rebuilding of Lytton really being resilient to future heat events, and that's going to be important for all communities and other climate-related risks. So just some of the budget items that were in the recent budget 2023 that speak to the initiatives that I've talked about. There was $1.199 billion to support emergency response and recovery, disaster preparedness and mitigation. We have a new Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness to move that work along. $300 million for repair or replacement of provincial public infrastructure, and $85 million for disaster risk assessment, preparedness and mitigation. So again, that's EMCR, Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. And the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund, so there's $152 million identified in this year's budget for that as well. So folks may have seen this website was launched in the last year. If you haven't checked it out, I'd encourage you to do so. There's a lot of good information here around disaster and climate risk, and a lot of resources for communities that are looking for information on how do we get more prepared. What should we be looking at? What are the funding programs, grants that are available? So that's the website there, or just Google Climate Ready BC. How am I doing for time, Patrick?
You have two presenters with you.
Okay.
Paul's here, so he said he can start, because you're still leading into Paul's presentation. And
Yeah.
It's a technical safety BC, so you're doing it excellent.
Okay.
So how many pages left?
I'm just about done. I'm on the last few slides. Okay, because I want to get to questions. So I mentioned before, partnering with Indigenous peoples is important, and we've done extensive engagement with Indigenous nations, organizations, elders, and youth through various forums, and we held a series of workshops, and we have had with our Indigenous Climate Adaptation Working Group hosted a provincial forum, Indigenous Climate Resilience Forum. So the one this year was held back in March. So Patrick is also a member of the Indigenous Climate Adaptation Working Group. That's the primary advisory group that we have for advice from Indigenous peoples on implementation of the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. So partnerships are a really important part of making sure that we are adapting to what we're hearing. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about the disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment. So these are the pillars that are identified. This is something that is being co-developed with Indigenous nations. And so that's the first pillar is co-development. Taking an equity-informed, strengths-based approach, building on local Indigenous and scientific knowledge, and supporting communities to support community-level action around assessing risk and taking action to address those climate risks. So this is just a graphic showing some of the vision and value mapping and the elements of that. As I mentioned before, this is being led by we're working in partnership with Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. This is really building off of the initial risk assessment that was done in 2019. And this will be much more comprehensive. So there was a decision to really, rather than just doing a climate risk assessment, is to build in disaster risk as well. And that's why it's got such a long name, Disaster and Climate Risk and Resilience Assessment. There's some upcoming sessions I wanted to highlight for folks that the Climate Action Secretariat is contracted with Alder Hill Planning. Ren Roberts here works for Alder Hill, and so we're organizing some sessions. So yeah, the first of which is next Friday. So yeah, I'd encourage folks to attend those, and looking for input on that province-wide disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment. This will lead to regional assessments to follow as well. So important work. And that's my time. Any questions?
Okay,
All right.
Mark,
Thank you so much.
sit down, and what I'm going to do is we're going to make sure that the two online presenters are well heard.